Throughout American history, certain political figures have stood at the center of intense public debate. These were individuals who held power at moments of uncertainty, change, or pressure, and whose leadership, rather than uniting everyone, revealed deep divisions within the nation. Understanding these figures requires stepping back from modern opinions and looking closely at the circumstances in which they operated. In many cases, controversy did not emerge because these leaders lacked experience or authority. On the contrary, most of them rose to power precisely because they were seen as strong, capable, or decisive. Yet leadership during periods of national tension often amplifies differences rather than resolving them. Economic stress, social change, or international pressure can turn even carefully considered decisions into sources of disagreement. For older generations, this pattern feels familiar. The United States has repeatedly faced moments where large parts of the population viewed the same leader in completely different ways. To some, these figures represented stability and order. To others, they symbolized resistance to change or decisions that failed to address deeper problems. These contrasting views did not appear overnight. They developed gradually as policies met real-life consequences. One reason these leaders became controversial is that they governed during times when expectations were unusually high. The public often looked to leadership for clear answers in complex situations. When reality failed to match those expectations, disappointment followed. Over time, that disappointment transformed into criticism, and criticism into lasting debate. It is also important to recognize that controversy does not automatically mean failure. Some political figures implemented policies that worked in the short term, but revealed limitations later. Others made choices that seemed necessary at the time, but proved difficult to defend as conditions changed. History rarely offers simple judgments, especially when decisions were made under pressure. Another factor that shaped controversy was communication. In earlier decades, leaders relied on speeches, newspapers, and limited television coverage. Messages traveled more slowly, and misunderstandings were common. What was intended as reassurance could be interpreted as indifference. What was meant as firmness could be seen as inflexibility. These gaps between intention and perception played a significant role in shaping public opinion. As we move through these stories, it becomes clear that controversial political figures are not defined by a single action. They are shaped by long sequences of decisions, reactions, and consequences. Their reputations often evolved over time, influenced as much by later events as by their original choices. This first part sets the foundation for understanding why controversy followed certain leaders throughout American history. Not because they sought division, but because leadership itself, especially during difficult eras, tends to expose the fault lines already present in society. And as we continue, we will see how power, popularity, and public doubt became tightly connected, often in ways that leaders themselves could not fully control. Political power in the United States has often been closely tied to popularity. Yet history shows that popularity can be unstable, especially when leaders are forced to make difficult choices. Many controversial figures began their time in office with broad public support, only to see that support weaken as expectations collided with reality. In moments of national uncertainty, citizens often look for reassurance and clarity. When leaders provide confidence, they are embraced. But when problems persist or grow more complex, confidence alone is no longer enough. This is where public doubt begins to form, not necessarily because a leader acted with bad intentions, but because the results did not match the hope people invested in them. Several political figures found themselves in this position. Early success gave them authority and influence, but prolonged challenges tested their credibility. Economic pressures, social changes, or international tensions forced leaders to make decisions that satisfied some groups while disappointing others. Over time, these compromises shaped how they were remembered. Public doubt often grew quietly. It did not always appear as open opposition. Instead, it showed up in questions, hesitation, and declining trust. Supporters began to wonder whether promises could truly be fulfilled. Critics became more vocal, pointing to inconsistencies between words and outcomes. This gradual shift is one of the most common paths toward controversy. Another important element was the changing relationship between leaders and the public. As media coverage expanded, political figures became more visible than ever before. Every speech, gesture, and decision was examined more closely. This visibility increased accountability, but it also magnified mistakes and misunderstandings. Leaders who once operated with limited scrutiny now faced constant evaluation. Popularity also created its own pressure. Leaders who were widely admired often felt compelled to maintain that image. This sometimes led to cautious decision-making or delayed action, especially when bold choices carried political risk. Ironically, efforts to preserve popularity occasionally contributed to later criticism, as unresolved problems became harder to ignore. It is important to note that public doubt does not erase earlier achievements. Many controversial figures made significant contributions that are still recognized today. However, history tends to remember leaders not only for what they achieved, but for how they handled decline in confidence. Managing loss of trust is often more difficult than gaining it. For older generations, this pattern is recognizable. Political figures rise, peak, and are later reassessed. What once seemed decisive may later appear incomplete. What was once praised may later be questioned. This is not a failure of memory, but a natural result of time and perspective. As we move forward, it becomes clear that controversy is rarely about a single decision. It grows from the ongoing tension between authority and public expectation. And in the next part, we will look more closely at decisions that did not just affect popularity, but changed the course of the country itself. Some political decisions do more than solve immediate problems. They quietly redirect the future of a nation. In the United States, several controversial political figures became controversial precisely because the choices they made continued to shape the country long after their time in office ended. These were not small adjustments, but decisions with long-lasting consequences. In many cases, such decisions were made during periods of pressure. Leaders faced economic uncertainty, social transformation, or global challenges that demanded action. Waiting was often not an option. Acting quickly, however, meant accepting imperfect outcomes. What seemed reasonable in the moment sometimes produced results that only became clear years later. One reason these decisions remain debated is that they affected different groups in different ways. Policies that strengthened certain sectors created strain in others. Measures designed to stabilize the nation in the short term sometimes limited flexibility in the long term. As a result, people experienced the same decision in very different ways depending on their circumstances. Another factor was the belief that decisive action would prevent larger problems. Some leaders acted out of caution, hoping to avoid greater instability. Others believed that bold moves would create clarity and direction. In both cases, the intention was often to protect the country. Yet intentions and outcomes do not always align perfectly. Over time, these decisions became reference points. Later generations looked back and asked whether alternative paths might have produced better results. This does not mean the original leaders acted without care. It means they operated with limited information and under constraints that are easy to overlook in hindsight. For many Americans, especially older generations, these moments are remembered not as abstract policies, but as lived experiences. Jobs changed, communities evolved, and national priorities shifted. Political debate moved from theory to everyday life, making leadership choices feel personal rather than distant. It is also important to recognize that some decisions gained support only much later. What was controversial at the time was sometimes reassessed as necessary or unavoidable. History has a way of softening judgments as context becomes clearer. In other cases, decisions once defended became harder to justify as their long-term impact unfolded. These turning points illustrate a central truth of political leadership. Once a decision is made, it cannot be undone. It becomes part of the national story. Leaders move on, but the consequences remain, influencing future choices and shaping public expectations. As we continue examining these figures, we begin to see a pattern. Controversy does not arise simply because leaders act. It arises because leadership decisions alter direction, and not everyone agrees on where that direction should lead. In the next part, we will explore what happens when good intentions meet unexpected outcomes and how the gap between plans and reality can define a political legacy. One of the most common sources of controversy in American political history is the distance between what leaders intended to do and what actually happened. Many political figures entered office with clear goals, carefully explained plans, and genuine confidence that their approach would improve the country. Yet over time, the results often diverged from those intentions. This gap did not always appear immediately. In some cases, early signs suggested success. Policies seemed to work, public support remained stable, and institutions adapted. But as circumstances evolved, weaknesses became visible. What had been designed for one set of conditions struggled to function under another. The original intent remained, but the outcomes shifted. A major reason for this gap is complexity. The United States is a large and diverse nation, and political decisions rarely affect everyone in the same way. Measures aimed at national stability might place pressure on local communities. Policies designed to encourage growth could unintentionally deepen inequality or create new dependencies. Leaders could not always anticipate how these dynamics would unfold. Another factor was time. Political terms are limited, but consequences are not. Some leaders made decisions believing that future administrations would adjust or refine them. In practice, those adjustments did not always happen, either due to political resistance or changing priorities. As a result, unfinished policies became lasting features of the system. Public perception played an important role as well. When outcomes differed from expectations, trust was tested. Supporters who once believed in a leader's vision began to question whether promises had been realistic. Critics pointed to the growing gap as evidence of poor judgment. Over time, this tension shaped how these figures were remembered. It is important to note that many leaders acknowledged these challenges. Some attempted course corrections, while others defended their choices as necessary under the circumstances. Neither response fully closed the gap. Once outcomes are visible, explanations often matter less than lived experience. For older generations, this pattern is familiar. Political intentions are remembered through speeches and campaigns, but outcomes are remembered through daily life. Changes in employment, social stability, or national confidence leave stronger impressions than policy language. This is why reputations often shift after leaders leave office. History shows that the gap between intentions and outcomes is not unique to any one figure. It is a structural challenge of leadership itself. Governing requires making choices in uncertain conditions, where even well-reasoned decisions can produce unintended results. As we move forward, this gap helps explain why authority sometimes meets resistance. When outcomes disappoint or create new concerns, public patience wears thin. In the next part, we will look at moments when political authority faced growing opposition, not out of hostility, but out of concern over direction and impact. In American political history, resistance does not always begin with anger. More often, it starts with concern. As controversial political figures exercised authority, resistance emerged gradually, not as outright rejection, but as hesitation, questioning, and growing unease. This stage is critical in understanding why certain leaders became so widely debated. Authority carries expectations. Citizens assume that power will be used to protect stability, fairness, and long-term national interest. When policies appear to drift away from these expectations, resistance begins to form. It may come from political opponents, from within the leader's own party, or from the public itself. Importantly, this resistance is not always ideological. Often, it is practical. Many leaders encountered resistance when decisions began to affect daily life in visible ways. Policies moved from theory to reality. Communities felt the impact, sometimes unevenly. What once sounded reasonable became more complicated when consequences were experienced firsthand. This shift from abstract debate to lived reality changed the tone of public discussion. Another source of resistance was the perception of distance. As authority became more centralized or insulated, some citizens felt disconnected from decision-making. Even when leaders communicated regularly, the sense that choices were being made far from everyday concerns weakened trust. Resistance grew not from hostility, but from a feeling of exclusion. It is also important to recognize that resistance often reflected fear of change. Political authority is most challenged when it attempts to reshape long-standing systems. Even necessary reforms can provoke concern if they move too quickly or without clear explanation. In such cases, resistance becomes a request for reassurance rather than rejection. For controversial figures, managing resistance proved difficult. Some viewed it as an obstacle to progress and pushed forward. Others attempted compromise, which sometimes diluted original goals without satisfying critics. Either approach carried risks. Pushing too hard increased opposition, yielding too much weakened authority. Over time, resistance became part of these leaders' public identity. They were no longer seen only as decision-makers, but as symbols of contested direction. Supporters framed resistance as misunderstanding or short-term discomfort. Critics saw it as evidence that leadership had lost touch with public concerns. From a historical perspective, resistance plays a necessary role. It reveals where authority and society diverge. It forces debate, adjustment, and sometimes correction. Yet it also shapes legacy. Leaders remembered for facing resistance are often judged not only by their policies, but by how they responded to opposition. For older generations, this phase is familiar. It reflects moments when confidence in leadership wavered, not because of scandal, but because of uncertainty about direction. These moments did not always end in crisis, but they left lasting impressions. As we continue, we will see how some political choices did not age well over time. Decisions that once seemed justified became harder to defend as circumstances changed. A key factor in long-term controversy. Not all political decisions reveal their true impact immediately. Some choices appear reasonable, even effective, when they are made. They address the needs of the moment, respond to public pressure, or stabilize a difficult situation. Yet as time passes, changing conditions can expose their limitations. In American history, several controversial political figures are remembered less for what they intended, and more for how certain choices aged over time. These decisions did not fail overnight. In many cases, they functioned well within the context in which they were created. The problem emerged later when circumstances shifted. Economic structures evolved, social expectations changed, or global realities became more complex. Policies that were once flexible enough to manage challenges became rigid, outdated, or misaligned with new priorities. One reason these choices aged poorly is that they were designed for stability rather than adaptability. Leaders often focused on preventing immediate disruption, assuming that future adjustments would be easier to make. In practice, once policies were established, modifying them required political capital, public support, and institutional cooperation that were not always available. Another factor was unintended dependency. Some decisions solved short-term problems by creating long-term reliance on certain systems or approaches. Over time, this reduced the range of options available to future leaders. What began as a solution gradually became a constraint, limiting innovation and responsiveness. Public perception also shifted as outcomes became clearer. Actions that once seemed pragmatic were later viewed as cautious or short-sighted. This does not mean those leaders lacked foresight. It means they operated in an environment where long-term consequences were difficult to predict and politically risky to address directly. For older generations, this pattern is particularly familiar. Many remember supporting or accepting decisions that later felt disappointing. Not because the leaders were dishonest, but because the future unfolded differently than expected. Time has a way of reshaping judgment, turning confidence into reconsideration. It is also important to understand that aging poorly does not erase earlier benefits. Some policies delivered real value for many years before their limitations became evident. The challenge arises when systems are not reviewed or adjusted as conditions evolve. In such cases, yesterday's solution becomes today's problem. These moments contribute significantly to controversy. Leaders are reassessed not only based on their original intentions, but on how well their decisions stood the test of time. History rarely asks whether a choice was understandable in the moment. It asks whether it remained effective as the world changed. As we move forward, we begin to see another shift. Some political figures were not fully understood while they were active. Their decisions were debated, criticized, or misunderstood, only to be reconsidered later, when their broader context became clearer. Not all controversial political figures were controversial because their decisions failed. In some cases, controversy emerged because their actions were not fully understood at the time. The pace of politics often moves faster than public reflection, and certain leaders were judged before the broader context of their choices became clear. During their time in office, these figures operated under pressure that was not always visible to the public. Information was incomplete, options were limited, and external forces shaped decisions in ways that were difficult to explain in real time. As a result, many choices appeared confusing, cautious, or even misguided to those watching from the outside. Public reaction, especially in democratic systems, is shaped by immediate outcomes. When improvements are slow or uneven, patience fades. Leaders who asked for time or emphasized long-term goals often struggled to maintain support. Their arguments made sense on paper, but reality demanded quicker results. This disconnect fueled skepticism and criticism. Years later, however, historical perspective began to change the conversation. Documents were released, global conditions became clearer, and comparisons with alternative paths became possible. In some cases, actions once criticized were later seen as attempts to prevent larger problems or to manage risks that were underestimated at the time. This delayed understanding does not turn every controversial figure into a hero, but it does complicate simple judgments. Some leaders were constrained by political structures, public expectations, or international realities that limited what they could realistically achieve. Their room to maneuver was smaller than it appeared. For older generations, this reassessment feels familiar. Time has softened sharp opinions and replaced certainty with nuance. Leaders once seen as ineffective are sometimes reconsidered as cautious. Those viewed as indecisive may later appear restrained rather than weak. History has a way of rebalancing perception. Another reason some figures were understood too late is that their contributions were indirect. Instead of dramatic reforms, they focused on maintaining continuity, avoiding escalation, or preserving stability during uncertain periods. These achievements are harder to measure and easier to overlook until they are gone. Controversy in these cases was not about failure, but about timing. The public expected clarity when conditions demanded caution. It expected speed when patience was required. Leaders caught in this mismatch often paid the price in reputation, even if their decisions proved defensible later. Understanding this pattern helps explain why controversy is not always a reflection of incompetence or wrongdoing. Sometimes it reflects the limits of public perspective during complex moments. Political figures operate in the present, while judgment often belongs to the future. As we move forward, we will explore how time reshapes reputation more broadly, how legacy and public memory interact, and why some controversies fade while others remain. In politics, reputation is often shaped in the moment, while legacy is formed over time. For many controversial political figures in the United States, the gap between how they were viewed during their careers and how they are remembered later is significant. Understanding this difference helps explain why controversy does not end when a leader leaves office. Reputation is immediate. It is built through speeches, media coverage, public reactions, and visible outcomes. During a leader's time in power, reputation is influenced by emotion, urgency, and expectation. Every decision is evaluated in real time, often without the benefit of distance or full information. This is why reputations can shift quickly and sharply. Legacy, on the other hand, develops slowly. It is shaped by long-term consequences, historical research, and comparison with later leaders. Policies that seemed controversial at the time may later be seen as foundational. Actions that were criticized may be reevaluated as cautious or restrained. Legacy allows for complexity, while reputation often demands clarity. Many political figures experienced a tension between these two forces. While in office, they were judged primarily by short-term results. Once out of office, their actions became part of a broader narrative. This transition often softened judgments, but it also highlighted decisions that could not be undone. Another factor influencing legacy is context. Leaders are remembered not only for what they did, but for the conditions under which they acted. Economic cycles, international pressures, and social change all affect how decisions are evaluated later. What appeared insufficient in one era may look reasonable when compared to alternatives that followed. Public memory also plays a role. Certain moments are remembered more vividly than others. Successes can fade, while controversial decisions remain prominent. This selective memory shapes reputation more than legacy, which tends to balance multiple aspects of a leader's career. For older generations, this distinction is especially clear. Many remember how certain figures were discussed at the time. the doubts, debates, and uncertainty. Looking back, those same figures may appear more measured, or at least more understandable, than they did in the moment. Time introduces perspective, even if it does not erase disagreement. It is important to note that not all reputations improve with time. Some decisions become harder to defend as their long-term effects emerge. In these cases, legacy reinforces criticism rather than softening it. History does not automatically forgive, it reassesses. The tension between reputation and legacy explains why controversy persists. Political figures are rarely defined by a single moment. They are defined by how their choices fit into a longer story. This story continues to evolve as new information becomes available and as society's values change. As we move closer to the conclusion, one question becomes central. How does time reshape our understanding of controversial leaders? And why do their stories continue to matter long after they leave the political stage? Time has a unique effect on political judgment. As years pass, emotions fade, immediate pressures disappear, and decisions once seen as urgent are placed within a broader historical frame. For many controversial political figures in the United States, time did not erase debate, but it reframed it. When leaders are in office, they are judged in the present tense. Every action is measured against current expectations, fears, and hopes. The public reacts to outcomes they can feel immediately. Economic conditions, social stability, national confidence. Once those leaders leave office, however, the lens changes. Their choices are no longer isolated events, but chapters in a longer story. One of the most significant ways time reframes leaders is by revealing what did not happen. Decisions that prevented escalation, avoided deeper crises, or maintained fragile stability are often invisible in the moment. Only later, when historians compare alternative paths, does the value of restraint or caution become clearer. Time also allows for comparison. Later leaders face similar challenges and make different choices. When those choices lead to worse outcomes, earlier decisions may be viewed more favorably. When they lead to better outcomes, earlier leaders may be criticized more sharply. In both cases, reassessment depends on contrast, not intention. Another important factor is access to information. Over time, documents are released, private discussions become public, and historical research fills gaps that were once unknown. Decisions that seemed arbitrary or confusing can later be understood as responses to constraints that were hidden at the time. This does not justify every choice, but it explains many of them. Public values also evolve. What was controversial in one era may become acceptable in another, or vice versa. Leaders are therefore judged by standards that did not fully exist during their careers. This creates tension between historical context and modern interpretation, a tension that fuels ongoing debate. For older generations, this reframing often brings mixed feelings. Some leaders once strongly supported may appear more flawed in retrospect. Others once criticized may seem more reasonable. This shift does not invalidate earlier opinions. It reflects the natural process of reflection that comes with time and experience. Importantly, time does not neutralize controversy. It refines it. The sharp edges soften, but the questions remain. Were there better options? Could different choices have produced better outcomes? These questions are part of a healthy historical conversation, not a verdict. As time reframes these leaders, it also reframes the public's relationship with political power. Experience teaches that leadership is rarely simple, and that decisions are often made between imperfect options. This understanding does not remove responsibility, but it deepens perspective. As we reach the final part, one issue remains. Why do these controversial figures still matter today? And what do their stories teach us about leadership, power, and public trust? The stories of controversial political figures do not remain in the past because the questions they raise are still with us. Power, responsibility, public trust, and difficult decision-making are not historical relics. They are permanent features of democratic societies. This is why these figures continue to matter long after their time in office has ended. One reason these controversies remain relevant is that they reveal how leadership functions under pressure. Every generation faces moments when clear solutions do not exist. Studying past leaders helps us understand how choices are made when information is incomplete, time is limited, and consequences are uncertain. These situations are not unique to any one era. Another important lesson is the relationship between expectation and reality. Public trust is built on hope, but sustained by results. When expectations rise faster than outcomes, disappointment follows. Many controversial figures were caught in this gap, not because they lacked effort, but because the challenges they faced were larger than what any individual could fully resolve. These stories also remind us that leadership is rarely judged only by intention. Good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes, and difficult choices are often criticized regardless of their necessity. This does not excuse mistakes, but it explains why political judgment is often more complex than it appears in the moment. For older generations, these figures are not abstract. They are tied to lived experience, to periods of change, uncertainty, and adjustment. Remembering them is not about reopening old debates, but about recognizing patterns that repeat over time. Political controversy evolves, but its core dynamics remain familiar. Another reason these controversies matter is that they shape institutions. Decisions made decades ago continue to influence policy, governance, and public expectations. Even when leaders leave office, their choices remain embedded in systems that future generations must navigate. Understanding this continuity helps explain why change is often slow and difficult. Perhaps the most important lesson is about humility. History shows that no leader operates with perfect knowledge or complete control. Judging past figures only by modern standards risks overlooking the constraints they faced. At the same time, ignoring the consequences of their decisions prevents honest reflection. Balance is essential. These controversial figures remind us that democracy depends not on perfect leaders, but on ongoing evaluation, debate, and accountability. Controversy itself is not a sign of failure. In many cases, it is evidence of a society actively engaging with power, rather than accepting it without question. In the end, these stories are not only about individuals. They are about the relationship between leadership and the public, between decision and consequence, between past experience and present understanding. They help explain why political trust is fragile, why consensus is difficult, and why history must be revisited rather than forgotten. Understanding controversial leaders does not mean agreeing with them. It means recognizing that the challenges they faced have not disappeared. They have simply taken new forms. And that is why these controversies still matter today.